I'd like to start our forum, our final forum. It's really encouraging to see all these conversations, actually. So for the last portion of the program, we've got an open discussion forum with our four speakers, so would anyone like to volunteer for a question?
I would like to hear all four of you convince me that science shouldn't be an advocacy, that you should be neutral. I see so much corporate money that is arguing the other side. I don't know why anyone would be hesitant to be an advocacy in the areas that you are an expert in.
I think I would not argue that scientists, in fact, I think there's a clear role for scientists to be advocates. And there's a whole discussion to be had about what it means to be an effective advocate. But the discussion is then for organizations like universities or the national academies. Should universities be advocates? It's very difficult for universities to be advocates, and I would argue that as an institution, it's not wise to be advocates. And so you have to think about what is the normative role and the effective role that a university can play. And so individual scientists, I encourage them to be effective advocates where they can, but recognize also that in being an advocate, there are likely unintended consequences. There's also obviously unintended consequences in terms of potentially career, but also to understand your own communication actions, that sometimes what you believe to be effective communication, like would argue that Australian video, the rapper video, I'm sure by some politically active scientists and others, they'll be calling for American climate scientists to do a similar rap video. If you piece that out, what it's looking at is, what is really the message there? It's a group of scientists speaking out against deniers. And we have a lot of that. We have a lot of that type of conflict adversarial communication. And maybe their energies as advocates are probably spent in other types of strategies.
Yeah, I could follow up. I mean, it's maybe just sort of preaching to the choir, to the question, but I thought that example of the video was a really poor example of scientists being advocates. I thought that was, probably the exactly wrong thing to do. I think they were in groups. But on the other hand, I have a guy that I've worked with several times. He's a USGA or GS scientist at Glacier National Park. And I would say he's an educator, but in his education, he is an advocate. So what he really does is he goes around and gives talks pretty much all over the country on the effects of climate change on Glacier National Park, right? And so he'll show these slides, historical slides. A lot of his program is historical slides of Glacier National Park and the receding of the glaciers now and then. Also habitat, the effects on grizzly bears, the effects on certain kinds of trout, all these sorts of changes that are just visually powerful. And so he's been extremely effective, but no one sees him as an advocate. He's a sort of modest guy who wears, pin protectors and, looks like, he's just not a, radical advocate-looking guy, and yet he has profound effect. And one of the things that I thought showed him, just how effective he is, just in, education, but at the same time, why he's there is because he thinks this is a real problem. One woman came up to him afterwards. I think she was more an evangelical, sort of wasn't sure, why she didn't believe in climate change, but she came up and said, well, thank you for allowing me to believe, sort of thing. And sort of she felt liberated that, she knew this was probably happening, but he gave her, this powerful sort of visual evidence. So I thought he's probably a good role model for science communication that also serves in a form of advocacy without having any sort of polarizing effect, I think.
Yeah, I would agree on much of that. I think scientists, of course, have a right to be advocates if they want to as citizens. But I think then another question is what's the purpose of the advocacy? So if the purpose is basically the scientist feels strongly and wants to get something out, that might be advocacy for a personal reason. It makes them feel like they're doing something. But we've seen all the impacts of boomerang effects. So sometimes by being an advocate, you're actually moving away from where you want to be. So I think it's a difference of looking at, I want to be effective, what's the best way to reach this outcome, versus I think I should be an advocate and I won't go past what the effects would be.
Well, I guess I think that, let me talk about smoking instead of climate change, because I think they're actually very similar issues. Except that we're just on the other side of the smoking debate. But I'm old enough to remember, and I'm sure I'm the oldest person in the room, so I'm the only one who's old enough to remember, when this debate actually looked very similar. And when the kind of science that was being done, and it was being actively done at land-grant universities to cast doubt on the connection between smoking and cancer and heart disease, was basically following a strategy that was obvious to anybody that knows a little science or a little epistemology, which is that, you can always design a study that will, play up the uncertainties, that will reveal them more clearly, that will be less conclusive, and you can always push these kinds of skeptical arguments. It strikes me that that's a case where you are, you're clearly, you want some sense of scientists stepping back from that kind of advocacy. I mean, that's a kind of advocacy that seems to have gone over the line, yet I don't think that there's much that we can say or specify in terms of hard and fast criteria that would distinguish the kind of scientific studies that were being done to disprove a link between or cast doubt on a link between smoking and these dreaded diseases, clearly, more objective kinds of studies that would have been, sort of taken the stance, well, we don't know, we're just going to, try to look and see it. It does strike me that there is inherently an element of judgment that is both personal and social, and that it is as scientists working in a community that is dedicated to the idea of trying to follow the evidence where it will go, and this is, I think, what we mean by objectivity, that you eventually, there eventually came to be a very strong consensus that, although we still can't tie smoking to disease in the case of any individual person, we can still continue to do work that would question the link between specific genetic predispositions and actually acquiring the disease, that it's just become overwhelmingly convincing that this connection is strong enough to, at the very least, warrant, I forget whose slide it was that said it's no longer controversial for government to discourage smoking, right? That it's now seen as pretty much an established kind of fact. So I do think that this ideal, and I use the word ideal advisedly, this ideal of objectivity is absolutely crucial to the very process of science, and that it's important to continue to probe and understand and try to develop that ideal, and to try to understand how it could inform particular research programs and the work of individual scientists. And then I guess the flip, which is kind of where we've been as we came down the thing, is that once you get to a point where scientists know something that the general public doesn't know, like that smoking causes cancer, or that, my example was another one that was totally uncontroversial, that leaving in an IUD can be, risky. It's I agree with my colleague Michael Nelson. At that point, you have a moral obligation to be an advocate, right? and you're not compromising the objectivity of your science to be an advocate in that sense. You know, it's very clear that you are in possession of a particular bit of information that, in virtue of your expertise, creates a moral obligation to become an advocate for, you know, certain kinds of action. So, although I don't know that I can, you know, pinpoint a specific set of standards, I do think that these notions of objectivity and advocacy are, in one sense, clear enough in a kind of common sense way that we really should continue to, you know, salute a certain kind of notion of scientific objectivity on the one hand, and also recognize that there can be circumstances in which scientists are morally obligated to advocate on the other.
I guess following up on that a bit, if we are trying to train our students to become more active, engaged, intelligent, articulate citizens, but we're standing back, I mean, we're training them to do something that we're saying we can't do. You see what I'm saying? I mean, it sort of puts us in a bad spot, right? Don't you want to model that sort of behavior?
Yeah, I think, I mean, one thing that needs to be done is actually more publishing and more discussion about the roles that scientists can play in public life. Because even within the label advocate, you know, there's a range of types of activities and goals that you can follow, and also you know, how you associate yourself, who you align with. So, for example, the example of you know, smoking causes cancer, which is, you know, widely accepted among scientists. Clearly, science has found a public health threat. Right? Scientists have a moral obligation to communicate about that threat. Communicating about that threat, does it make them an advocate? Probably not. If they then say that science has found this threat related to smoking and cancer, and then they start to promote a particular policy option that Congress is considering, then they probably are an advocate. But if they say smoking has caused, smoking causes cancer, there's no controversy about that, science has pointed to this danger, here are 5 different policy choices that Congress, one is clearly at the head of the agenda, but here are these other policy choices for dealing with that problem. Here's what science says. Here's, based on these policy choices, how it might affect this problem that science has pointed to. Then I would argue they're not being an advocate. They would be along the lines of what Pelkey talks about as an honest broker, that they're not trying to reduce the choice of policy options. Rather, they're playing a role as an expert, saying, here's how science would relate to these 5 policy choices, right? But probably the worst thing for a scientist to do is to actually play the role of an advocate, but then to claim that they're just a scientist. Because in doing so, then, what you're risking is public trust. That you're not being upfront about your values, you're not being upfront about your goals, and you're simply saying, well, you know, science points to the need for cap and trade. And that's just a scientific opinion, that science, you know, policy should follow science, and that policy happens to be cap and trade. And I actually think a lot of that happened on climate change, where scientists not being policy people, they actually, the only option they knew of as a policy option was cap and trade. And because of their values, in that they tend to have stronger liberal values, they're better off in terms financially. There was never really any self-reflection about what cap and trade meant, or even really probably a lot of information about what it would do, whether it be effective, what the cost would be. Whereas for other Americans, there was a lot of reflection on that. It inherently was threatening to their values, and that's where a lot of the opposition came from. So there was a path dependency that matched science to one policy option. And as part of that, there became a lot of stealth advocacy.
Yeah, I want to actually answer that question from the perspective of somebody who's on the agriculture faculty of a land-grant university, which I think actually is a little different. I recently attended a meeting in Michigan. We had some colleagues from the University of Michigan, a little school down the road that some of you may have heard of, who are working on agriculture, particularly in tropical areas, but also in Michigan, and were urging us to, as a group, kind of come out with a pretty strong statement advocating, some particular vision of sustainable agriculture. And my colleague from Ann Arbor said, I can't imagine that this will cause enough of a stir that it would have any consequences. And I said, as a faculty member at Michigan State, I can imagine a lot of scenarios in which this would cause lots of consequences. And maybe this is just something that's unique about the history of agriculture and the agricultural sciences. It would be interesting to think through some of these things. But, it would have been difficult as a member of the faculty at the University of Kentucky in 1969 to be very strong, make very strong statements about the link between tobacco and cancer. And, frankly, it would be difficult as a member of the faculty at Iowa State to be way out front on energy balance and corn-based biofuels. And, I'm sure that's a topic that's probably come up in some of the discussions around here. And, in a certain sense, we have, fortunately, one of the things that's kind of fortunate about being at a place like Michigan State is that we actually don't have a dominant commodity group. And so we have a little bit more freedom as faculty to make some statements, but we're limited, and we are, in some sense, very much expected by agriculture producers to be advocates for agriculture, and oftentimes that means saying things like drink more milk, irrespective of any links between dietary fat and cholesterol and things like that. And I think it's I think there may be that I do think this is an interesting part of the history of the land-grant university. It connects up with a time in which we had very large percentage of our population in agriculture, and they were poor. And being an advocate for agriculture was being a very, out there, egalitarian, let's promote improving the lifestyles of poor people kind of perspective. And that's not the way our farmers are today. And yet many of our traditions and many of our relationships, continue to have some of these these continued characteristics. So I think it's when you ask the question, what should we do, and you speak as a member of a faculty member and a land grant, I think it's a harder question, and I definitely feel some sense of I'm quite aware of motivations to engage in a certain self-censorship and to very carefully modulate things that I say in ways that I probably wouldn't if I were down the road at Ann Arbor or at a private school. I think it's an interesting overlay on some of these things that we've been talking about here.
I'm going to ask more or less the same question, I think, in a completely different way and from a different perspective. If the university is to be nonpartisan and non-advocative, how does one avoid being sort of postmodern and end up arguing against any and all specific value propositions and against the power of science to contribute to the resolution of public policy issues?
Like I said, I was part of a group at the University of Montana that started a climate change studies minor. And they study the science, they study the policy, and ethics. And the end of it is they're supposed to go out and become interns or practicums and actually get involved in solving these issues, right? So I have not thought of that as being partisan. It's just that here's the science, guys. And we study the science, and here's the policy and what's going on in the world. And students self-select. I don't think we have students who, they have a choice whether or not to be in this minor, whether or not to take these classes. No one's required to. I don't see it as being partisan. I just see it as, look, guys, we have this problem here. We need to think about it. We need to do something about it. And I think it is sort of taking a stand that we need to take action and think this through. So I don't think, I've never thought of that as being a partisan position. It's just that sort of the standard position that we have a problem that we need to think about and attempt to resolve, right? And we don't start with, in any of the classes, that I know, even start talking about climate change as a debatable issue. We just start with the science and bring the scientists in, and they talk about oceans and climate change. They talk about mountains and climate change. We bring in anthropologists who talk about history of science, societies that have gone through climate change. And, I don't really feel as though I'm ever being an advocate in the class when I talk about ethics and policy. We just, here's the way people are thinking about it. It's almost as if we don't even talk about that debate, and then the students don't raise it. We just take off and go. So I don't know if that answers your question. It's not, I don't see it as an advocacy, other than that, fulfilling my obligations as students, as an educator.
And keep looking at me, I wouldn't see that as advocacy either.
Yeah, I was trying to check. Is it advocacy?
Students, if nothing else, they sign up.
Yeah, they sign up, but they're free to take the course or not. Right?
And they choose what they want to do with it.
Right. That's exactly right. They don't have to take it. It's a complete option. Of course, once
What
you're...
if your university voted to require every student to take a course on climate change that involved a project where they had to go out and solve climate change?
Yeah, that would not be right. But although there was a controversy, we had a sustainability fee. Like a $10 or $20 attached. And that was a little controversial because that did commit us to lowering the university's carbon footprint. So that was a little bit different, I think. The other thing, to address your question, I have thought about this because we were talking about it in a class the other day, is we teach this Introduction to Climate Change course. And we actually taught it in the building that had the largest carbon footprint on campus. And also in teaching this class, I'm often wondering, should I always ride my bike to school, even when the weather's bad? There are those kinds of things. If you're teaching this class, you better sort of ride your bike to school, and we better not put this in the classroom with no windows, and the air conditioning blaring, the heating all year round. There are those kinds of things, and are we teaching this class at a university that did sign, the president's agreement to, become carbon, lower? And we have done a few of those things, but I think the students are aware of that. Because it was a student that pointed out to me that we were teaching that class in the building with the largest carbon footprint, which was a mistake, which was definitely a mistake.
Or not.
Yeah.
It was a good lesson.
Yeah.
It raises the question of how do we, it raises in a very poignant way the question of how do we both commit ourselves to sustainability and lead the lives that, like fly you guys in.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the university takes an advocacy position as a university on sustainability. We're very proud of our solar compact area thing, and we live green, and you've probably seen that. But I have a different question. I have a question for you, Dr. Musick. I think one of the issues that bothers people a lot is that, maybe you included this in the report, I've only read chapter 1. These corporations that can be causing a lot of, contributing a lot of pollution and a lot of problems, have amazingly effective marketing stories and narratives where they are doing just, they're just good. I mean, when you look at the ads, I don't know if it's GE now or what, but they're just good. They're good. I mean, they got these African villagers, they got just wonderfully good, the company is. And it's real vague, and it's real feel good, and it seems to me it's incredibly sophisticated and touches every button. So is that part of what you're including in the money that you talk about organization spending?
Yeah, I mean, you could do a whole study on advertising expenditures and strategies, and that's probably merited. Right. So in the chapter on looking at financing, there's total amount of expenditures by the not-for-profits on either side. So it's environmental groups versus conservative think tanks, advocacy groups, and industry associations. And when you look at those two long-standing coalitions that have been locked in a battle over climate change, if you look at the resources that each side has mobilized, environmental groups hold an upper hand in terms of total money, in terms of both revenue, total spending, and spending on climate and energy-related activities. So that's the central finding of the report. And then the story of the report is to try to contextualize, well, they have a lot of resources, but what are they limited in terms of what they can spend it on? And so that the rest of the report then looks at what data do we have on things like advertising, lobbying, donations to members of Congress, independent expenditures. And when you're thinking about lobbying and advertising, you have to think about what are the corporations that are aligned with these not-for-profit groups, right? And so when I talk about advertising, in terms of the data that we have, we do know exactly how much Gore's Group spent, about $33 million in 2009. We know how much EDF spent, was about $9 million. We know how much the Clean Coal Coalition spent, which is about $30 million. But the Chamber of Commerce and the American Petroleum Institute, the Chamber of Commerce was spending most of their advertising. They spent a ton of money on advertising. I think it was something like $80 million, but most of that advertising was on healthcare. And the American Petroleum Institute does a lot of image advertising for the industry. And so what I talk about is that you look at the oil companies in terms of how much they spend on advertising. And the only data that we have available is from 2010 that was purchased by Gore's Group and released from a marketing firm that tracks that. So you have to pay for that money for them to do the analysis. And so Gore's Group released that, so it's a little bit self-serving, but they spent, BP spent something like $100 million in 2009 on image advertising because of the oil spill. But the other oil companies were spending something between like $20 and $30 million. But what's interesting about their advertising is they don't advertise around policy issues. They don't say, don't support cap and trade, et cetera. But what their advertising does is that they have, it's possible they have an indirect influence on public opinion because of the way they frame themselves, is that they're investing in renewable energy even though that they're spending only 1% of their profits in that area, right? Or like Chevron did an advertising campaign where it was, so in that case, responsibility for the energy problem is with companies, right? And they're taking responsibility through being socially responsible, right? The Chevron did a campaign where they had individuals saying, I will walk to work, I will turn off the lights, right? So in that case, responsibility for the energy problem is about individuals, right? In between that, there's no, it potentially deflects attention away in terms of attribution and framing from a role for government, right? And that's what the report says. It just says, there's these uncertainties about who spent more on either side in terms of advertising because we have direct money. And then we know oil companies spend a lot of money on image advertising. No one's really done the studies to look at how this might shape public opinion, but here's how we know how they frame the issue. And it leaves it at that. So so in the response to the spending analysis in the report, the critics have taken this complexity, this uncertainty that I intentionally put into the chapter, and then have used it against me. So, for example, he says, by Nisbet's own number, he says that BP and the oil company spent $140 million on advertising in 2009. Well, yeah, actually in 2010, that's where the numbers are from. But that wasn't about cap and trade, and we don't know exactly what the impact on public opinion is possible, right? But that's what the report says. But they then just take it and say, well, it's 8-to-1, 10-to-1, 20-to-1, right? But in those areas like lobbying and advertising, you can't say that. That goes beyond what the numbers allow you to do. So.
Well, if you were willing to conjecture, why do you think companies like Richard Daniels Midland and those companies advertise to a certain demographic that tends to be sophisticated, smart, whatever, and they're all about good things. They bring good things to life. They make things better. They're smart people, right?
Well, General Electric was one of the lead companies that was in support of cap and trade. It's unclear how much they spent lobbying in support of the bill. And that's one of the implications of the report. The environmental groups say that companies like General Electric, Duke Energy, they signed up to support the bill but didn't spend money to lobby it, even though they had a lot of lobbying muscle to bring to the table. So the implication, therefore, is that if an environmental group spent 3 years trying to bring GE into the fold, but then GE didn't step up to bat, then a big bill strategy like cap and trade in the future probably won't work, because who's to say that companies will step up to the bat in the future? So that kind of undermines that strategy legislatively, potentially. But yeah, the image advertising on the part of the companies in terms of framing everything in terms of either corporate responsibility or individual responsibility, whether it's agriculture or climate change, that's an important thing to look at. But then again, Gore's Group spent a ton of money on advertising. If anything, what's interesting about the report was that everyone assumed that Gore's Group was spending $100 million a year, because that's what Gore said he was going to do. But their actual numbers, this is the first time their actual numbers are actually reported and released, show that Gore's Group spent only $33 million in 2009. So there was the presumption, and then the Clean Coal Coalition actually raised money on the idea that Gore was spending $100 million a year. So when Gore launched his campaign, there's a lot of this about really, Gore launched the campaign because he thought the environmental groups couldn't coordinate their money and coordinate their message, so he was going to do it for them, right? But he intended to raise and spend $300 million over 3 years, but he only spent, by the end of 2009, something like $140 million. So he fell well short of his spending goals. And from what I've heard, that no one knew what his group was doing in 2009. They didn't know what his strategy was, and it was very difficult then to plan around.
Time for one more question before we wrap up our time. We have the rooms at 4:30, so we got past like 6 minutes. And about 35 minutes past our total time normally allotted. Is there anyone who'd like a question? I want to do two things. I'd like to thank our panelists, but before we go to leave, I'd like to give Jean a chance to give some closing remarks. So first, let's give a round for our panelists.
I just wanted to make sure that we all said thank you to Michael Dahlstrom.
Yes.
3 months ago, he was just a regular assistant professor.